Joseph Gerson, who I've got to know quite well in the last 2 days as he's staying with me. He works for the American Friends Service Committee, active in anti-war and anti-nuclear movement. For many years, organizer of the Chicago anti-NATO protests, which were a little more violent than ours yesterday. He's a very erudite speaker, so off you go.
I just want to credit Joe Lombardo, who I think is in the audience here, as a major organizer of the march and protest in Chicago. So, you know, to share the glory around. I've been asked to speak around about U.S. nuclear weapons and NATO and nuclear weapons, and with the combination of the time limit and respecting what jet lag was going to do to me, I wrote out a text. So if you'll excuse my reading a text as opposed to speaking extemporaneously, away I'll go. Let me begin by saying that you should really be proud of the roles that CND, the British peace and anti-war movements, have played in opposing NATO, which is now a global military alliance, in blocking Obama's plans to attack Syria last year, as Medea was saying, and for your leading roles in the struggle to eliminate the world's nuclear arsenals and to save humanity from itself. I hope you understand that the campaign against the replacement of Tridents is fundamentally important. It's one of the brightest opportunities we have to, if you will, open up the global disarmament movement. And I would add that as we think about the law of unintended consequences, I was speaking early this month, with Austrian Ambassador Kemet, who's the principal person responsible for organizing the third conference on humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. His hope is to split the nuclear powers and to get at least a couple of them to the conference in Vienna. And so, you know, your pressure could help to lead Britain to break, possibly the United States as well. Friends, the Ukraine war reminds us that NATO is a nuclear alliance, that the dangers of catastrophic nuclear exchange didn't disappear with the end of the Cold War. Despite growing calls for the withdrawal of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons from Europe, last week in the pages of the Washington Post, elders of the U.S. establishment, people like Scowcroft and his colleagues, urged that this week's summit reaffirm NATO as a nuclear alliance, ostensibly to deter Moscow's adventurism. They ignore Russian memories of the catastrophic Napoleonic and German invasions all across the West, all from the West and all across Ukraine. They've either forgotten or never learned the lessons of common security that led to the end of the Cold War. And clearly the path to peace includes Ukraine becoming a neutral nation like Austria during the Cold War, with considerable regional autonomy. In today's press, we could read that major sectors of the U.S. elite are now talking about cutting the losses and to allow the Donbass area, eastern Ukraine, to split from Ukraine as a whole. You know, the best possible result of that, would be a division, like the division of Korea. And we continue to have to deal with those causes and those forces and those military tensions now 60 years after that war. In the tradition of U.S. exceptionalism, the U.S. argues that it is a benign power that is simply defending European security. In fact, NATO's expansion to Russia's borders, U.S. and EU aggressive policies in Ukraine, Washington's overwhelming superiority in so-called conventional weapons, U.S. efforts to monopolize the militarization of space, and its overall military superiority led to Moscow's seizure of Crimea, and as a result of the expansion of NATO, Russia has also increased its reliance on nuclear weapons. C. Wright Mills, the famous American sociologist, would have described all of this as crackpot realism. Friends, during the last years of the Cold War, millions of people moved to action on the basis of the scientific studies that said that a nuclear exchange, massive nuclear exchange would lead to global winter. ending all life as we know it. The truth of the matter is they were underestimating the dangers of nuclear war. We now know that a detonation of as few as 100 nuclear weapons would cause global cooling so severe that the resulting famine would kill at least 2 billion people. 2 billion people. Anybody ready for a limited nuclear war in Europe or between India and Pakistan? Looks like getting different time signals from different people here, so here we go.
I'm the chair.
Yeah, I know. Remember too that the world is still freighted with more than 16,000 nuclear warheads, more than 90% in the US and Russian arsenals. In the early stages of the Ukraine war, both the US and Russia conducted nuclear war exercises. And Daniel Ellsberg, who is best known for revealing the secret history of the Vietnam War, and was also a senior nuclear weapons advisor to 3 US presidents, is certain that US and Russian nuclear forces have been on high alert during much of the Ukraine crisis. The Ukraine war should be a powerful warning that given the history of nuclear miscalculations and accidents and the dangerous dynamics of nationalism, that we should be working for the elimination of nuclear dangers as if our lives depended on it, because they do. NATO and its nuclear war preparations are a good place to begin global disarmament. We're told that the US and NATO nuclear weapons are designed to be deployed for deterrence, despite the repeated threats and preparations to initiate nuclear attacks during international crises and wars. The Pentagon has been clear, stating that deterrence, quote, has never been our doctrine, end quote. And despite Obama's pledge in Prague, first strike nuclear attacks still play significant roles in the US military doctrines. Since they were first deployed in Europe, US and NATO weapons have been about rather more than classical deterrence. One of the primary purposes is to prevent Europe's decoupling from the United States, which would lose the US its western toehold on Eurasia. The idea, as Brzezinski explains it, is that to be the world's dominant power, we have to dominate Eurasia with toeholds in the West, Europe, South, Middle East, now Ukraine, and in the East with the Japan alliance and the US pivot to Asia. So for this reason, to prevent the decoupling, that the US is now spending up to $10 billion to modernize its B-61 arsenals. So, with time pressing here, let me just say that in terms of the nuclear threats, there have been about 30 during wars and crises, most of which have been to maintain US hegemony in the Middle East and in East Asia. The book outside where you can find the list. Let me just say here that Joseph Rotblat, who was the single member of the Manhattan Project, senior scientist, to resign because of moral qualms, put it very succinctly when he said that the human species faces a stark choice. We can either completely eliminate the world's arsenals, nuclear arsenals, or we'll see their proliferation and the inevitable nuclear wars. In closing, what I want to do is to encourage you to keep up the pressure on Trident replacement. As I said, it's fundamentally important. We have 2 other openings in the nuclear abolition movement in the coming months. In December, many of us will be gathering in Vienna for the 3rd International Conference on Human Consequences of Nuclear Weapons, which is being designed to build momentum going into next April's Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. That conference provides one of the few pressure points that we have, along with the non-aligned movement and others, to require the nuclear powers to finally fulfill their obligation under Article 6 to negotiate the elimination of their arsenals. We're not going to win in April 2015, but it's a way that we build our movement for the longer term. Simply to say that we've organized an international planning committee, which is beginning to mobilize for next April's review conference. Some of us will be meeting this evening, and I hope that many of you will either come to New York to help build that pressure, or that you'll find ways to, with people in other countries, to hold demonstrations, find ways to build pressure in the countries where you live. Sorry about that time.